Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Butler. I'm the Manager of Policy and Research for the Ontario Good Roads Association. It is my pleasure to welcome you here to the latest webinar series that we've been doing in collaboration with a number of stakeholders looking at the effects COVID-19 are having on the municipal sector more broadly and specifically on transportation infrastructure issues. Today we are fortunate to be joined by members of the Municipal Engineers Association, and specifically we're going to be diving into the effects that COVID's had on the administration of the municipal class environmental assessment process. For a number of years, the two organizations, OGRA and MEA, worked collaboratively, MEA in the lead in terms of ideas, and OGRA using some of its political leverage to call for reforms to this issue more broadly. You'll see on the panel today a number of familiar faces for those of you who've been following this call for, I think, a common sense reform to the environmental assessment project or process more broadly. Today we are joined by 𝗣𝗂𝗪, Executive Director of the Municipal Engineers Association, Amin Mania, the Coordinator for MEA and OGRA, and Paul Knowles, who I think is widely recognized as being the leading light in terms of calls for for reform to the municipal class environmental assessment. So the flow today is pretty simple. You'll see on the module that's opened up, there's a question and answer button down there. Simply click on that and pose questions. Paul's going to run us through a process or through a presentation. And then afterwards, the questions will be put towards the panelists, and we will be able to have an opportunity to hear from you through the question or through the chat function and have your questions answered. So without any further ado, and recognizing time's of the essence, I'm going to turn it over to Paul, who's going to run us through a slide presentation. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Scott. And I'll just put the slideshow up. Let's see. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Scott's done a great introduction, and yeah, my name is Paul Knowles. As some of you may know, I've been around with the municipal engineers for a number of years. MEA is the custodian of the Class EA and has been since it was created. And I've been around sort of since the late 1980s on the committee that's looked after this. Now, recently, our priority has been to amend the Class EA, and in particular, the project schedules. But today, what we really want to talk about is the consultation process in particular, and go through what the minimum requirements are. How do you make your consultation effective, and what special things you can do with the COVID-19? How do you accommodate that? And we actually have some actual project examples to show you. And I want to, at the end, just talk a little bit about the Schedule A+ consultation process. So just to get right into it, many of the questions that we've been receiving relate to the notices, public engagement, and posting of the EA materials. So let's start with the notice of commencement. The notice of commencement is mandatory, so that's clear. It contains certain information such as the proponent, the contact, project name. So as I was saying, many of the questions we've been receiving have relate to the notices and the public engagement and the posting of EA materials. So let's start with the notice of commencement. Notice of commencement is mandatory and must contain certain information such as the proponent, the contact, project name, MEA schedule, problem statement, project location, consultation opportunities, and the initiation date. And there are very specific directions regarding how the notices be sent to the ministry, MECP. And we're not going to go through that today. That's easy on the website. However, other than the specific direction about how you have to contact the ministry, there's a lot of flexibility in how you decide to notify others, other stakeholders. Now, the book talks about an advertisement in a newspaper twice in 2 editions, but that's not the only way, and we'll talk about more about this in a few minutes. The MEA manual also requires mandatory public contact. And I want to point out that the wording in the Class CA is public contact. It is not public meeting. And in recent years, it's been very common that public contact has been in the form of an open house. And again, this is not the only acceptable form of public contact, and we'll be talking about some options for that shortly. The Class CA process concludes with a notice of completion. And similar to the notice of commencement, there's specific rules about what has to be in the notice of commencement and specific rules about how it has to go to the ministry. But there's a lot of flexibility on how you decide to share that with the other stakeholders in the public. And the same with the Class EA materials. It's mandatory for your ESR for Schedule Cs or your project file for Schedule Bs to be placed on the public record. So again, the wording in the Class EA is it must be placed in the public record. It's not that it must be paper copies available at your library or City Hall. So there's flexibility. A hard copy at the counter in the municipal building was, seemed like the way to do it in the 1980s when that sentence was written. But really, the information, it just must be reasonably accessible for stakeholders and posted consistent with what your notice is. So if you said in your notice it's going to be at such and such a location, then that's what you have to do. But there's some real flexibility in what you do, what you decide to do there. So this chart out of the class legally, the legal requirements to meet the minimum. But what we want to do is not just meet the minimums. We want to have effective consultation. And what we want to talk about today is how we do effective consultation while conforming with the COVID-19 restrictions. So the first point I want to mention is section A.3.5.3. And this is the section that talks about notices going out, and it talks about 2 editions in the newspaper. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't read the next paragraph where it says, and by the way, proponents or municipalities are welcome and in fact encouraged to develop their own policy for notices. And then once you have a policy that says your notice is going to be placed on a website or whatever your policy says, then that's what the minimum for your municipality is. It is not use a newspaper. So really suggest you go talk to your clerk. The Municipal Act actually requires all municipalities in the province to have a notice bylaw. And that bylaw must set out how the municipality notifies its residents in relation to a number of things covered by the Municipal Act, such as passing a budget, things dealing with the election. There's requirements of what must be in the bylaw, but it's entirely a local decision of how you notify your residents, your citizens. So talk to them, and it's be wise that your Class EA policy meshes with that policy and you use the same vehicles. That's the recommendation. But basically, you're not bound to use a newspaper at all if you have your own policy that says what you're going to do. Now, on the second point here about review agencies, again, for MECP, it's very prescriptive. They have set it out in very specific detail, the form they want it in and who it goes to. Other review agencies, of course, the usual method is email and that's not going to change with COVID, of course. The third point here about the EA documents, and again, I mentioned this earlier, the key phrase in the Class EA is that it must be placed in the public record. It doesn't say it has to be hard copies. It doesn't say any of that. It talks about that as an example, but the requirement is that it be placed in the public record. So yeah, in the 80s, this meant a hard copy. However, today, a digital copy on the website is far more useful. And I want to make 2 points about this. EA documents must be accessible at the location described in your notice of completion. I think I just mentioned that. Whatever you put in your notice of completion where you say the documents will be, that's where they have to be. And during COVID-19, I think proponents need to be prepared to offer special arrangements. If you do post it on the website and some citizen, make sure citizens are aware if they have trouble accessing it to contact you, and you get a call and somebody that just doesn't have access at home to a website, to a computer to access a website. You might normally send them to your library to access it that way, but of course libraries are closed. Well, maybe you're going to have to take them a hard copy or ask them what their concern is, and maybe you give them a printed hard copy of the sections that they're particularly interested in. So I think you have to be prepared to do that. Take those extra steps during this time. So right at the beginning of the process, the proponent needs to develop this a consultation plan, and this is in section 3.5. And what you have to put in your communication plan is how you're going to identify the stakeholders, what means you're going to use to contact them, what's the level of consultation, so what exactly are you going to do, the general timing, you need to outline that. And through the process, you need to be prepared to be flexible and change things to accommodate things. Well, for example, COVID-19, you're in the middle of a process and you said you were going to have an open house in the spring to present things, and all of a sudden you can't. So of course you have to change things, announce it, and be flexible during the process. You need to lay out your plan, your consultation plan, prior to even sending out the notice of completion. So we're going to go through a little detail here of each one of these points. So identifying the stakeholders is relatively easy to adapt. You would you get your team that's managing the project, and you decide, are you going to send out letters, flyers, signage, emails? Are they going to go to adjacent owners, users of the project, general community, special communication, community groups, government agencies, Indigenous people? These are the people that you need to reach, and the project team needs to decide how you're going to reach each one of these groups. So the only really special accommodation I see here is have virtual team meetings. You're going to be doing it in some kind of Zoom setting or something instead of getting together in person. So you have your team meetings and you carry on and you identify your stakeholders. And then you got to decide what means you're going to use to reach these stakeholders. And there's a wide variety of ways, right down to social media. There's paid ads on that, paid ads in newspapers, press releases, physical contact is, a personal contact is a way, but of course you're going to have to respect physical distance, and perhaps you might just use the phone instead. So what you end up doing is identifying all of your stakeholders, and the thing is you got this wide range of means of contact, and don't use the same for all of them. And use what's appropriate. So your adjacent owners and tenants, they might be more appropriately reached by actual letters or flyers, delivered to the property. users of the project. If you've got a bridge you're working on, the people that travel over that bridge, you may not even know who they are, but signs would be very useful perhaps. The general community, there's ads, web page, social media, special community groups. This probably requires some kind of individual contact, but it can be by telephone or email. Government agencies email, of course, and Indigenous people, you got probably multiple ways you're going to try and engage them. So then we talk about the level of consultation and what are you going to do? You've decided who the people are we need to talk to, who are the stakeholders, how we're going to reach them. Now, what are we going to do with them? And this, of course, depends on the complexity of the project. But the common approach, of course, has been the open house or public meeting. There's still possibility of personal meetings. Website is another great tool. And we'll talk about a virtual open house. And I've got some examples to show you. Community surveys are another way, or online discussion groups. These could be done as well. So an open house, just so we're clear on definitions, is generally you take a room, you set up this display boards around the perimeter, you invite the public to come in, and you have staff there that can meet them at the boards and actually speak to them and walk them through the information. And it allows for some calm one-on-one discussion, which is very helpful. It provides the opportunity for detailed discussion on individual issues. Somebody's particularly interested, of course, in what the project's going to impact their property, and other people don't care about that. It's great for that opportunity. The one thing is possible that it could be a drawback is that the message you're delivering could be heard differently. So you're talking to one person, you give them what the answer, or you explain an issue, and the next person comes along and has a different point of view on the issue. And although you have done your best to say exactly the same thing, it can be heard differently by people, and then they go outside and if they feel they've heard one thing and somebody else hears another, that's can be a concern. So the other approach that's possible here is a public meeting. And I guess what I define a public meeting, different from an open house, it's the setting where you got a group in a room and you stand at the front, you make a presentation to the audience all at the same time. And then everybody does hear exactly the same thing. They may still hear it differently, but they all hear the same message at the same time. The meetings, of course, can degenerate. You could get, so often you don't want to head down this road. And it's very difficult to address individual issues if somebody really wants to talk about just their property. But the thing, you may want to keep something like this in mind if there's, say, two possible preferred solutions that maybe the proponent is not too concerned which option there is. They choose which route for a road, for example, but the community has strong feelings one way or the other, and there's two different groups. A public meeting is advantageous because one group hears what the other group has to say. And you may decide to do a blend of those two things and have some public meeting component in an open house. Have during our 4 to 8 o'clock open house, we're going to have a presentation at 7 o'clock. So you may do something like that. So these are all just general comments about public meetings and open houses. And of course, none of that can happen during COVID with the COVID restrictions. So what can you do to replace that? So this is an example Halton did, and the text is a little hard to read here, so I've blown it up. But they had they had their public contact And what they said is the display boards will be made available to the public on the website and starting December 5th. And your public's encouraged to review them and submit comments by December 19th. And they actually didn't have a room and have the display boards. They just put it on a website and asked people to submit their comments. This is public contact, so this satisfies the minimum requirements. And this really wasn't related to COVID. They just decided that this met the requirements for that project and the community. They felt it was sufficient, and I think it worked out very positively. So I've got a couple of other examples to show you here of ways to do virtual open house. Yeah. So this is from a consultant that you can see. You put your mouse over here and it blows up the board for you, blows up the display board. You can show a video, click it and it'll play a video. You can have some pictures. So this is one option, is you can create essentially the feeling of an open house, but you can do it all on the screen. So there's one example of a virtual open house. Now another one is to launch a video. So I'll show you this example of what happened in Niagara. And we'll just let it run for a few minutes or just a short time to.
Third Public Information Center for the South Niagara Falls Wastewater Environmental Assessment. I'm 𝗣𝘂𝗶. I'm the Senior Project Manager with Niagara Region, and I'm joined here with Chris 𝗲𝗴 from 𝗣𝗂𝗞. He is the project manager on the consultant side leading this project. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. This is a great opportunity for those who would like to stay at home and join us on our venture for the PIC material tonight. Hopefully you are able to view the boards as Chris walks you through them for the next little while. This video, as well as the boards, will be available on our project website, so feel free to join in and look at any time, as well as provide comments as we move throughout the next few weeks. So tonight, the much awaited, we have worked through the last few months doing the evaluation for the alternative solutions for the new wastewater treatment plant. So tonight we are we are presenting to you the preferred solution for the wastewater treatment plant site, as well as the outfall location and the sewer network. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Chris 𝗲𝗴, who will walk you through the material for tonight. Thank you, everybody.
That's great, Lisa. Thank you. And you just reminded me that we're live, so we can't say cut and start over here. So this is great. But anyways, I'm Chris 𝗲𝗴 with 𝗣𝗂𝗞, and this is an exciting PIC for our project. So as Lisa was highlighting, we're going to be showing the preferred site, preferred outfall, and
So I think you're welcome to follow that the link and watch the whole thing if you want. But basically, you can take out your phone and watch. Instead of bothering to attend the open house, you can essentially walk around with the staff, with the consultant, and see all the boards on your phone. So another approach is this one.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for the Highway 401 Expansion Public Information Center. I'll be presenting on behalf of West Corridor Constructors, or WCC for short. WCC was the consortium selected by the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure Ontario to design and construct the Highway 401 Expansion project. The purpose of this Public Information Center, or PIC, is to provide an overview of the project, describe the environmental assessment process, summarize the traffic and environmental impacts and mitigation, identify next steps, and outline how you can stay informed and involved. This video presentation will briefly take you through some of the key features and details of the Highway 401 expansion. In addition to this video, we have additional PIC resources available for.
So I think you get the point there. And again, you're welcome to watch the whole thing, but it's kind of what we're doing right now. You're watching a slideshow and listening to a dialogue that explains the points, and you post it on the website. So that's another avenue to hold a virtual open house. And of course, with all these avenues, you provide a link or some method for submitting comments and input. So another effective tool is often community surveys or online discussion groups. They're good ways to gather feedback from the community. You got to be a little worried about controlling the message though. Sorry, I'm just trying to close something here. What I'd be a little concerned about here is if you get into an online discussion that you control the message. And an example some of you may have seen is a couple of years ago in the UK, the National Environmental Research Council was launching a new vessel, and they decided to put it out for public comment on what to name it. And you can see the names below and the number of votes, and the highest the highest vote getter was 𝗣𝗂𝗞 that not really what I think anybody had in mind for their research vessel. They were forced into announcing, we were pleased that people are embracing the idea in a spirit of fun. Then this, your whole message then is about the story or the fun and not the actual project that you're undertaking. So be careful on how you phrase that and how you get into public discussions that way or surveys. Personal meetings allow detailed discussion, and they're very worthwhile. They're time consuming, they're very worthwhile. And of course, you're going to have to modify to respect the social distancing. So you're going to have to either, for the most part, try and do it on the telephone, I would think, with personal meetings during COVID. The website is another excellent way to provide information to stakeholders, and then you can include a feedback opportunity very easily. And here's an example of, again, it was Halton Region. They had a project, so here's the map, study highlights. They talk about their alternative solutions, talk about the preferred solution, timeline, next steps. So I'm sure you've all seen great websites, and it's a very, very useful tool to have available for people. That's that example. So the consultation plan needs to have talk about the general timing. So once you've nailed down who you're contacting, how you're going to contact them, then you still need to lay out the general timing of things. And what you're going to end up doing is putting a chart, something like this, that describes your time frame, when your notice of commencement goes out, public information centers, identify them, when you expect to have things. So there aren't exact dates, but here's your general timeline. If you're combining it with another process, like a planning process, then it's a great idea to show the two together, see how they're going to work together. And as I said before, be sure and remember to build in flexibility. Monitor this as you go through the process and decide you want to alter things, then just say, we're changing it. So that's special accommodation during this time. One of the things you might look at doing is extending the time that you're allowing for input and review. So, maybe you want to give people 45 days or 60 days instead of 30 if you think there's some reason. It's going to depend on the community, depend on the project, but if there's a reason why it's a good idea. Special arrangements for review of material, I mentioned that earlier. Be cooperative that way. Follow up with people that haven't been interested. So if you're in the middle of a process and a group or a person has expressed interest at the outset, and then you have your next virtual open house and you don't hear from them, I think you probably need to directly follow up and make sure they're satisfied, or are they did they not hear about your virtual open house, or were they not able to participate? And I think you should be putting that extra effort into trying to make sure people are consulted. And if you have to, you might need to consider postponing the whole process if you can't ensure that there is reasonable opportunities for participation. So these are just general comments. It's going to be on a case-by-case basis that the proponent's going to have to make these decisions as you go through. So that's kind of going through the consultation process in the Class EA for Schedule B and C projects. And I just want to talk for a minute about the Schedule A projects. And of course, to date, Schedule A projects have been relatively minor, and it's very vague. It really just says community must be notified. And that's about all the guidance that's in the current document. Well, I mentioned we're working on an amendment, and the amendment has not been approved, and we're not too sure. We're sort of stalled with this COVID-19. We're not too sure when this is going to happen, but we're certainly pushing for it. And it looks like first of all, the scope of projects that will be covered in Schedule A is going to grow. And it's always been things like new fences, new retaining walls, resurface a street, replacing services. The new one is LID features, but they're not too controversial usually. Another one, but it can be, A+ projects can be fairly major in their impact to the community. You think about reconstructing the main street in a municipality, right through the middle of businesses. That's a A+ project, always has been, but it's still a major impact to the community. And just just putting out one little notice is not going to be sufficient. And then some of the things we're looking at adding are reconstructing heritage bridges, new pumping stations, water storage, projects at treatment plants. These becoming A+ projects, again, are more complex and warrant a higher level of consultation than just a simple notice. So what we're looking at is, what we want to really direct proponents to do is think about the complexity of the project. And section 8.2.1.1 of the Class EA talks about this, is you have to, the level of consultation needs to match the level of complexity of the project. And you should be sitting down for A+ projects and consciously doing a consultation plan. So that same process of identifying the stakeholders, what are the means of contact, the level of consultation, the general timing. You need to be going through that process for A+ projects as well as B and C. Now, for a simple project, like let's say the project is we're going to put a new fence up along a road and of course in the adjacent property. So I'm going to go through the process. Who are the stakeholders? Well, it's the adjacent owners. That's probably reasonable. They're the only ones that really care. How's the best way to contact them? I think a letter would probably be appropriate in this case. What's the level of consultation? Are you going to have meetings? Like what, what's the involvement? Really not much. Just in this case, you'd send them one letter. It'll explain, we're going to build a fence. It's going to look like this, and it's going to be constructed during this time frame. And the timing of when you do that is you get the letter out, of course, prior to construction. So you might wait until you have the contractor lined up, so you could say construction is expected to begin on such and such a date. So if you've notified them, you haven't even really, there's a name at the bottom. If they have questions, they can always call you, but you're not really looking for particularly public input. This is just a fence you're putting along a road. So pretty simple, straightforward. You might not bother to write down the consultation plan, but at least you thought about it from that vein. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if you're going to rebuild the main street, as I mentioned, well, first of all, you need to really think about who your stakeholders are. And they're likely the general community, adjacent owners, the BIA, chamber, maybe a cycling committee, an accessibility committee, a beautification committee. Could be all kinds of groups that are very interested in that. What means of contact are you going to use? You're going to use signage, web flyers. You're going to vary this depending upon what the groups are and how you want to reach them. How many times will you consult? This could well be, you could have a virtual open house if it's, if the restrictions are still in place, but this could span over a year. You could be working in September to talk about existing conditions and identify priorities. And, those Main Street reconstructions are typically trying to balance off the priorities of parking, cycling, and streetscaping. And of course, within a given road allowance, the property only allows you to usually not do a good job on all of them. So by November, you might have options to consider. And then you'd probably have special individual meetings with stakeholders over the winter, and by spring you could take your, here's the final recommended solution to a final presentation to the public, and then go to council. This sounds pretty close to a Schedule C process, and it is. From a consultation point of view, I think it would be largely like a Schedule C process. It's going to differ in the level of documentation required. There'd be no Part 2 orders possible because these are all local issues. It's a Schedule A project. But the actual level of effort through consultation is going to be pretty similar. So I just want to point out that you need to keep that in mind when you're talking consultation. The minimum requirements for B and C are laid out, but in Schedule A press projects, which are going to become more common, it still needs to be a pretty major consideration. So that's the comments I had lined up for you today. And then I wanted to leave time for questions. I'm sure there's lots of questions. I'll just point out that we're also working on a new Heritage Bridge checklist, and that we're hoping to maybe have a webinar on that before too long. We're really hoping that there will be this amendment to the Class EA, and we'll have to have some training on that as well. And then the municipal engineers host usually a couple of times a year. We offer a course on preparing a municipal Class EA, and we're going to look at maybe trying to do that virtually in the near future, since the restrictions aren't likely to get lifted too soon. So watch for those things coming up. And you can always forward questions. We get questions on a regular basis to the Municipal Engineers Association. And we're also planning on posting a recording of this presentation and a copy of the slideshow on the MEA website. So thank you, and be pleased to try and address some questions.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
Well, I was just going to jump in and say thanks, Paul. Dan and Amin have been monitoring the questions, and there certainly have been lots of them coming forward. I'm going to turn it over to Dan to moderate a bit of a discussion here. So Dan, the floor is all yours.
First of all, thanks, Paul. We're on track. We're going to try and run this till about 5 minutes after the hour to respect everyone's time. We got off to a bit of a slow start. It is the MEA's first webinar, and so technical issues, we're still figuring things out, but I think all in all, it went fairly well. I have a number of questions here, and what I'm going to do is address the ones that have been upvoted on the most, and we'll address as many as we can in the next 15 minutes or so. And any questions that we cannot answer, we will post answers on the website sometime after this session is completed. So if you don't hear your question asked to Paul, not to worry, we'll have answers posted on the website. So Paul, the first question I'm going to ask on behalf of a bunch of delegates are you required to mail out notices for virtual PICs if the municipal bylaw doesn't cover this process?
Well, I guess in the ideal world, you've already got your policies set up that you can do it through the website. But certainly in this era of, right at this time with the COVID-19, there's all kinds of council meetings happening virtually. The province actually passed an act that allows things to happen virtually despite people's bylaws. So I'd be looking heavily at something like that. But mailing something out, I don't know, you're going to mail it to everybody? I'd certainly put extra effort into contacting everybody that was involved earlier in the process. And then you might want to choose to just say, well, our interim policy is to advertise through Facebook or something. You got to come up with something reasonable.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And again, we will post answers to questions that Paul is answering, as well as any questions we don't get to on our website after the webinar. Next question. Can notices of completion still be issued given Ontario Regulation 73-20, which says any order establishing limiting period, i.e. the 30-day review period, be suspended during the emergency? MTO's current view is that the regulation's reference to order was not broad enough to suspend the MTO Class CA 30-day comment period.
I mean, I'm not familiar with that regulation, but no, I actually did talk to the Ministry of Environment and reviewed this slideshow with them on Monday, and they didn't have any comments or concerns about anything about, the message we're delivering is that there's no reason you can't go ahead in this COVID era if you just make some special accommodation. So no, I don't believe there's any impact.
Thanks, Paul. Next question is very interesting to me, as I live near an Indigenous community and it is closed. The question, Paul, is, sorry, I just lost it here. I just lost the question here. But it was basically, I'll just paraphrase it. Are there any concerns with how you communicate with an Indigenous community when most of the communities have closed? And I could tell you as an example, Paul, Six Nations community is closed. You can't get there. Don't know what light you could shed on that question.
Yeah, that is something that I chatted with the ministry about as well, that exact question. And particularly, if you've started a process and the Indigenous community has expressed interest, and now you're ready to show the preferred solution and try and wrap it up, and you can't contact them, you might have to seriously look at having to defer that and postpone it. That's, if they're interested, you can't just go ahead and not allow them the opportunity because they're closed. Now, many organizations that are closed, it's still possible to actually contact them, and you may be able to accomplish that. So put some extra effort into it. And if you can actually manage to, I realize you're closed, but could you look at this while you're closed? We don't have to get together. If you can do that extra effort, then by all means do it and proceed. But that's an example where you may have to postpone.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Next one's another good question. This is just asking for an opinion, Paul. Is there a concern that doing consultation primarily online could result in more Part 2 orders because it isn't seen by the public as adequate?
I doubt it. In fact, I did see a survey done just the end of March, and it talked about I think it was 70% of people agreed that online consultation was just as effective as in person. So, so I don't think that's going to be I doubt it. I doubt it.
Okay, Paul. The next one is not really a question, it's a comment, and I'll just read it. And if you have some added comments, please do. There are certainly lots of online options for virtual open houses or posting of information and reports. However, the fundamental issue is accessibility. Not everyone has access to computers, cell phones, and tablets. I just lost the question. When people are voting online, it moves the question away from my screen. It got moved up, I guess. Tell me, well, I've lost it. But anyways, they're just basically wondering, the comment is, if people don't have access to these virtual tools, is there any concern about that we haven't been able to reach that segment of the community?
Well, it is somewhat, and that's where I think the proponent needs to try and understand their community and how the project might relate. But yeah, there's a possibility that there are people that that can't access things digitally, but that's getting less and less. I don't know what else to say about that. People are going to get left out.
Okay, Paul, do you have any recommendations for the filing of a master plan?
Well, I guess in terms of the consultation side, it would be the same as an ESR, like the same, you want to post the information, you want to try and get your consultation out in the same fashion. So consultation strategy, I think, would be the same that we just talked about for a Schedule B or C process.
Thank you, Paul. Another good question here is, do you have any suggestions about how to ensure that directly impacted property owners are properly notified when the property owner is a business that is currently closed due to COVID-19 and there's no one on site to receive a registered letter?
Yeah, that's a little tricky. If it's in the BIA area, hopefully you can talk to the BIA, and they would have probably home contacts for those business owners. I think this is where you have to sit and put extra effort into things. You can't just circulate a flyer to businesses that are closed and expect that to be notification when they're closed. So you need to put that extra effort into, okay, who owns that business? Where do they live? Pick up the phone and call, track down their phone number and call them. Or, maybe the BIA can help you out there.
Okay, thanks, Paul. The next question, does the consultation plan need to be updated if projects are mid-course?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if something changes during your process, then update your consultation plan. COVID is an example of, we were planning an open house. We told you You know, in December, there was going to be an open house in March. Well, we're not having an open house. We're doing this instead, and this is why. You know, that being said, things change all the time. You know, I think before and after COVID, there's other reasons things change. You may encounter something and you may decide you need an additional open house to deal with some complex issue. And that's fine, just tell people.
Hey, thanks, Paul. I kind of like the next question. By the way, there's no prize for the best question, folks, but this one is a good one. Could this be a time where online consultation is more palatable for the public? And is there any concern with extremely large levels of participation due to boredom and access on the internet? I like that.
Well, myself, I don't think that it's a danger having too much input, as long as you're on top of it and controlling it. I mean, you don't want the 𝗣𝗂𝗞ህ 𝗀𝗀𝗀 example of, you know, your process getting dominated by something that isn't really the prominent part of your project. So you need to really pay attention and to that and not let that happen. But I don't think having too much consultation is a problem. Interestingly, that survey I was reading, another question that got asked was, do people feel that you know, the online stuff will take over and the face-to-face, the one-on-one meeting or the face-to-face open house is going to go the way of the dodo bird and not be used. And the feeling was from the public, no, it still has an important place and will make other, you know, these other considerations during this unusual time, but likely in the future, it should come back as a normal way of doing things.
Next question. Do you know what tool ACOM used for the virtual open house? Plugged in.
I do not. I suspect it. I get the feeling it's a proprietary. It's something they developed specifically for themselves.
Call ACOM. It looked pretty cool.
Yeah, I thought it looked pretty neat, but I suspect if you want to have that, you need to engage ACOM.
Our Class CA is on the border of Phase 1 and Phase 2. The municipal co-proponent has a hold on non-essential newspaper advertisements to avoid distraction from COVID-related notices. Would the minimum consultation requirements still be met if a joint notice of commencement and invitation of public comment was issued in Phase 2? There is an example of this in the MEA manual.
Well, I guess if it's a joint project and you issue a joint notice, then sure, yeah, I guess. Yeah, I should say, and the third point I remember from that discussion was the majority of people, the question asked in this survey at the end of March was, what is the people, should the government be bothering you and consulting with you on issues that are not related to the emergency and not related to COVID? And the answer was, I think it was about 65% of people said, yes, you should. You know, the world doesn't need to stop entirely, and please go ahead and consult me on those other issues.
Okay, thank you, Paul. This question here, another good one. What about filing an ESR document? How could the mandatory notice of completion be advertised, and how could the ESR be made accessible? I think you did cover this in your presentation, but go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Just to reinforce you. So you issue your notice of completion and you, I guess, come up with a policy that says you're going to issue it via, you know, contacting everybody who's expressed interest, a social media blast, you know, notice on the website, you know, whatever. And in that notice of completion, one of the things you have to say is the ESR will be placed on the public record, and it will be, and you say it's going to be at this website, and then it's on the website and you're done.
A couple more questions here. We're getting through quite a few of them. Do remote meetings meet AODA requirements? Is the Ministry, Environment, Conservation, Parks okay with it, given that some portion of the population doesn't have access to a computer or internet at home?
Well, I don't know about AOD, but certainly the Ministry of Environment was fine with having virtual meetings. Yeah, that's what we discussed. That's the way to, and as I said, this isn't just about the examples I've shown you are were all these are real life examples that happened before the COVID crisis. So they are not just a reaction to COVID.
Okay, and the last question for the webinar is where do you place your ESR report if you cannot physically place it at a counter or at a public library or a rec center?
Well, digital is the way to go. So you're going to put it digitally on a website, and I can't imagine people not doing this anyway. Likely the common thing has been it's on the website, and then it's also available hard copy at a counter someplace. Just leave the website, because that's the one everybody's going to look at.
Okay, Paul, thank you very much. The MEA wants to thank the OGRA for letting us use your Zoom platform to conduct this webinar. MEA will be, as Paul had indicated, we'll be providing more webinars in the near future, so stay tuned. We'll let you know via e-blast or notices on our website or social media. There are a few questions we didn't get to, not to worry. We'll have those answered and posted on the facts page on the MCEA website. On behalf of the MEA, thanks to all municipal employees for doing your bit to make sure services are delivered to Ontarians during the COVID crisis. Thank you very much for your efforts. And Paul, thank you once again for providing your knowledge on the MCEA process. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.